The observation deck of the Meridian's Hope smelled faintly of recycled air, and the particular kind of anxiety that no filtration system could quite scrub away. Adrian Reeves pressed his palm against the reinforced viewport, watching the Andromeda Veil, nebula ripple like oil on water. Somewhere in that cosmic soup of ionized gas and stellar nurseries lay the heart of the Vitheran Empire, and somewhere in that heart was a conversation he was absolutely categorically unprepared to have. Your cortisol levels suggest you're contemplating either imminent death or public speaking, Iris observed through his earpiece. The AI had developed what Adrian generously called a personality over their 3 years together. Less generously, he called it a nuisance, with processing power. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Adrian muttered, turning from the viewport. The nebula had begun doing something unsettling, pulsing in rhythm with the ship's approach, as if the universe itself was breathing. Valtharian space had a reputation for making physics negotiable. Remind me again why they picked me for this. You demonstrate abnormal cognitive flexibility when interfacing with non-human cultural frameworks. Also, Ambassador Chen was caught in a rather spectacular scandal involving a Rielian trade minister and what I'm legally obligated to describe as exotic fungus. Adrian snorted despite himself. I really need to start reading the diplomatic newsletters. The ship shuddered gently as it passed through what the instruments unhelpfully labeled as a probability membrane. Adrian had stopped asking the Valferan pilot for clarification after the third explanation involving mathematics that technically didn't exist yet. Some species developed faster than light travel. The Valurans had apparently just asked space-time very politely if it wouldn't mind bending a little. He made his way to the preparation room, where his formal diplomatic uniform waited like a textile execution. Dark blue austere, decorated with exactly 3 medals he'd earned during the Proxima negotiations, and approximately 40 pounds of implied human civilization. He dressed slowly, reviewing the briefing materials one last time on his datapad. Valtheran Empire First Contact initiated 2243. Initial cultural exchange promising. Subsequent trade negotiations collapsed following misinterpretation of gift-giving protocols. Border conflicts 2245 present. Casualties 3,247 human, estimated 5,000 plus Valferan. Known weaknesses, none confirmed. Known strength extensive. Current mission objective, establish ceasefire through territorial compromise and technology sharing agreements. The file conspicuously fails to mention their ability to make visiting diplomats spontaneously question the nature of reality. Adrian said that's page 47 subsection D, under metaphysical phenomena, do not panic. The Meridian's Hope shuddered again, but this time it felt different, like passing from water into air, a fundamental change in medium. Through the viewport, the nebula had parted like a curtain, and beyond it hung something that made Adrian's breath catch. The crystalline spire shouldn't have been possible. It rose from what appeared to be a planet-sized platform, a structure kilometer high, that resembled a single enormous diamond caught mid-growth. Light moved through it in ways that hurt to watch directly, refracting and reflecting, and somehow amplifying, until the entire edifice glowed with its own bioluminescent aurora. Smaller ships darted around it like silver fish, leaving trails of disturbed photons. I hate to admit this, Adrian said quietly, but that's actually beautiful. Aesthetic appreciation noted. Also noted, structural composition defies 17 known principles of material science. The Valfurans built it 4,000 years ago during what they call the era of harmonious remembering, which our xenoanthropologists believe translates more accurately to that time we figured out how to argue with physics and win. The docking procedure took 20 minutes, and involved the ship being gently grabbed by what looked like tendrils of crystallized light. Adrian tried not to think about what would happen if those tendrils decided to squeeze. He'd read exactly one report about Valoran defensive capabilities before his security clearance ran out, and the rest of the file turned into intimidating black bars. The airlock cycled with a sound like wind chimes. The gravity shifted as he stepped through, not uncomfortably, but noticeably, as if he'd suddenly become 15% more substantial. The corridor beyond was carved from the same crystalline material as the exterior, but the walls moved slowly, subtly, images flowing beneath the surface, like memories trying to surface in water. His Valuran escort waited precisely 3 steps inside. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, with skin the color of burnished copper and those distinctive ears that swept back from her skull in elegant curves, studded with small luminescent gems that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Her eyes were entirely gold, no visible pupil, no white, just liquid metal that somehow conveyed acute assessment. "Captain Adrian Reeves," she said in perfectly unaccented English. "I am Sentinel Veres. The Queen awaits. Please follow exact footsteps." The floors are currently set to guest-compatible spatial configuration, but this fluctuates. "Fluctuates?" Adrian repeated. "Yesterday, a visiting Cantheran diplomat took an unauthorized left turn and briefly existed in two places simultaneously. It was very awkward for everyone involved." Adrian couldn't tell if she was joking. He followed her exactly, stepping where she stepped, watching the walls flow with what might have been historical records or artistic expressions, or possibly live feeds from other parts of the spire. A battle scene materialized and dissolved a marketplace. Two Valorans engaged in what looked like either a passionate argument or elaborate foreplay. The cultural briefings had been fuzzy on that distinction. "How long have your people built with this material?" Adrian asked because silence felt heavier than words here. "We don't build with it," Veres said without turning. "We grow it. This structure is alive. Captain, you're walking through the crystallized nervous system of an organism that achieved consciousness approximately 6,000 years ago and decided it enjoyed being architecture." "Of course," Adrian said faintly. "Why wouldn't it?" They climbed a staircase that spiraled upward through impossible angles, each step humming slightly under Adrian's boots. Music, maybe, or the building's version of breath. His legs informed him they were climbing, but his inner ear kept insisting he was walking on level ground. He focused on Veres's back and tried not to vomit diplomatically. The throne room, if that's what it was, opened like a flower. One moment they were in a corridor, the next the walls had simply pulled back, rearranging themselves into a vast circular chamber whose ceiling disappeared into luminous mist. Dozens of Valfurans stood in concentric circles, dressed in garments that seemed woven from light itself, constantly shifting through colors Adrian was reasonably certain humans hadn't evolved to perceive. And at the center, elevated on a dais that floated approximately 30 centimeters off the ground, sat Queen Lysara. She was smaller than Adrian expected, more compact, but radiated presence like a star radiates heat. Her skin was darker than Vars's, deep bronze veering toward black, and her ears were decorated with rings of silver that chimed softly whenever she moved. The living fabric of her gown cycled through emotions, deep blue calm, flickers of red curiosity, occasional green that Adrian's briefing suggested meant calculation. Her eyes, like all Valtharian eyes, were solid metallic color, but her shifted between gold and copper depending on the angle. "Captain Adrian Reeves," she said, and the translation device in his ear rendered her voice as warm contralto, though he could hear the harmonics beneath. She was actually speaking in what sounded like 3 simultaneous tones. "You come seeking peace." Adrian performed the formal bow he practiced for 6 weeks, arms crossed over chest, head lowered exactly 45 degrees. "Your Majesty, I come as representative of humanity's unified council, authorized to negotiate terms for lasting ceasefire and mutual prosperity." "Yes," Queen Lysara said. "I have reviewed your proposals, the territorial adjustments, the technology exchanges, the trade corridor agreements, all very thorough, very measured, very—" She paused, and her gown flickered through several colors Adrian couldn't name. "Human." Something in her tone made Adrian's carefully prepared speech retreat into the back corners of his mind. "Your Majesty, but tell me, Captain, what do you know of Kesharthal?" Adrian's translation device made a small distressed noise, cycling through several possible meanings before settling on something approximate. I'm afraid that's not a term in our databases, Your Majesty." The Queen smiled. It wasn't an unkind expression, but it had weight. "No, you wouldn't have encountered it. The concept doesn't translate well to species who view alliance as contractual, rather than another pause." Her rings chimed. "Essential." She rose from her floating dais, descending with movements that were just slightly wrong, not disturbing, but noticeably operating under different physical assumptions than human motion. She approached Adrian until she stood close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her skin, fractals that went down several layers. "Captain Reeves," Queen Lysara said softly, "I will be direct as I understand your species values this quality. We have reviewed every treaty proposal, every compromise, every technological exchange humanity offers. They are all insufficient. Adrian's stomach dropped. 6 months of preparation, 3 years of preliminary negotiations, 10 years of bloodshed. And however, the Queen continued, there is one path to lasting peace between our peoples, one bond that in Valoran culture supersedes all political consideration and creates harmony that cannot be broken. She gestured, and the assembled Valfyrans parted. Through the gap walked a younger woman, perhaps 25, with the same distinctive ears and golden eyes, but something fiercer in her bearing. She moved like controlled violence, each step precise, and her expression suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else. This is my daughter, Princess Kaelin, Queen Lysara said. If you want peace, you will marry her human. The throne room was completely silent, except for the soft chiming of the Queen's earrings and the distant hum of the living building. Adrian's brain attempted several responses simultaneously, resulting in a sound that Iris would later describe as somewhere between a question mark and a mechanical failure. I'm sorry, Adrian finally managed. Could you repeat that? That my daughter's hand in marriage, Queen Lysara said calmly, as if discussing agricultural imports. Accept this bond, and our peoples unite in Kesharthel Refu, and we will understand that humanity considers Valorans unworthy of true connection. There can be no peace between species who will not join. Princess Kaelin's expression suggested she was contemplating several forms of reicide. Adrian's expression probably suggested he was contemplating several forms of diplomatic suicide. Adrian said intelligently. You have 48 hours to decide. The Queen said Veras will show you to your quarters. My daughter will visit you this evening. I suggest you use this time wisely, Captain. The fate of 2 civilizations now rests on a considerably more personal foundation than you anticipated. She turned away, dismissing him with a gesture. The assembled Valfyrans began to disperse, their luminous garments trailing light like afterimages. Princess Kaelin held Adrian's gaze for one long burning moment, then turned and stalked away with movements that suggested she was imagining his head on a spike. Adrian stood frozen until Vars touched his shoulder gently. Captain, we should go. Standing confused in the throne room is considered poor form. Right, Adrian said distantly. Poor form wouldn't want that. As Vars led him back through impossible corridors, Iris spoke quietly in his ear. Well, this is unexpected. That's one word for it, Adrian muttered. I'm currently calculating the statistical probability that this mission would result in a marriage proposal. The number has so many zeros that it's technically become a philosophical statement not helping Iris. I'm also noting that technically this falls outside your diplomatic authority. The Council authorized you to negotiate territorial agreements, not matrimonial ones. Adrian laughed, and it came out slightly unhinged. I don't think refusing on a technicality is going to start this peace process off well. No, Iris agreed, but I thought you'd appreciate knowing you're not actually obligated to marry an alien princess to prevent interstellar war. Just encouraged, too. Enthusiastically encouraged with extreme prejudice. The quarters Very showed him to were actually quite comfortable. Once his eyes adjusted to the way, the walls occasionally became transparent for no apparent reason. He sat on something that was probably a bed and put his head in his hands. Your heart rate is elevated, Iris observed. I'm getting married to an alien princess to prevent a war. Potentially getting married. You haven't decided yet. Right, that makes it so much better. Through the translucent wall, Adrian could see the nebula beyond the spire, still pulsing with that strange living rhythm. Somewhere out there, humanity waited for news. Somewhere in this impossible building, an angry princess was probably plotting creative ways to murder him diplomatically. Adrian Reeves had come to negotiate peace. Instead, he'd been offered a wedding. He started laughing again, and this time, he couldn't stop. Adrian spent the next 3 hours doing what any reasonable person would do when offered an arranged marriage to prevent interstellar war. He paced, panicked quietly, and attempted to research Valoran wedding customs on an information network that operated on principles he couldn't begin to understand. This node suggests that traditional bonding ceremonies involve what translates roughly as voluntary neural entanglement, Iris reported. I'm hoping that's metaphorical. Is it metaphorical? The article includes 17 footnotes and a warning about irreversible consciousness merger. So unclear. Adrian collapsed onto the bed thing, which responded by adjusting its density to perfectly cradle his spine. Even the furniture here was unsettlingly considerate. He'd managed to access what passed for Valuran historical records, though the interface kept trying to reorganize his thoughts into what it called more harmonious query structures. Apparently, humanity's linear approach to information retrieval was considered charmingly primitive. What he'd learned wasn't reassuring. Kesherethel wasn't just marriage in any sense humans understood. It was a complete metaphysical binding, a deliberate interweaving of what the Vatharans called essential resonance. Married Valtharans could sense each other's emotional states across distances, shared certain memories, and allegedly experienced reality through a partially merged consciousness. One anthropological paper he'd found written by a human researcher who'd studied Valtharian culture for 2 decades concluded with the line, "They don't fall in love and then marry, they marry and then become a kind of love that human language cannot accommodate." "That's not ominous at all," Adrian muttered. "There's also a section on divorce," Iris offered helpfully. "And it involves a council of empaths, 3 months of guided meditation, and occasionally low-grade psychic trauma for both parties. The Valurans consider it roughly equivalent to voluntarily amputating part of your soul." Still not helping, a chime rang through the room, musical, complex, probably encoding information he lacked the neurology to process. The wall nearest the entrance shimmered and became transparent, revealing Princess Kaelin standing in the corridor, with an expression that could freeze stars. "May I enter?" she said flatly. It wasn't really a question. Adrian stood quickly, trying to remember if there was protocol for receiving alien royalty in your quarters, when said alien royalty was your proposed unwilling bride. "Of course, Your Highness." She walked in like she owned the space, which technically she probably did. Up close, Adrian could see details he'd missed in the throne room. She was tall for a Valkan woman, nearly matching his height, with a kind of posture that suggested extensive military training. Her ears were pierced with small crystals that pulsed with faint red light, irritation. According to the briefing files, she wore practical clothing rather than court finery, dark-fitted garments that looked designed for movement rather than ceremony. So she said, crossing her arms, "You're the sacrifice they're throwing at me this time." Adrian blinked. "This time?" 3 years ago, the Cantheran Consortium tried to negotiate peace by offering a bonding with one of their merchant princes. He lasted 6 hours before fleeing back to his ship, claiming our culture was metaphysically incompatible with his profit margins. She smiled without warmth. Last year, the Sarathi sent a diplomat who seemed promising until he learned that Kesherthel would mean actually feeling his partner's emotions. Apparently, the idea of mandatory empathy was too radical for his people's individualist philosophy. "I'm sensing a pattern," Adrian said carefully. "The pattern is that I'm a very expensive bargaining chip that nobody actually wants to cash." She walked to the transparent wall, staring out at the nebula. "Tell me, Captain Reeves, what did they brief you about me? What does human intelligence say about the Valuran princess?" Adrian decided honesty was less dangerous than diplomacy. "That you're 26 years old, trained as a tactical specialist, commanded a border patrol fleet during the Proxima incident, and that you have a reputation for being uncompromising." "Uncompromising?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "That's a diplomatic way of saying I've killed 83 human soldiers in direct combat." The number hung in the air between them. Adrian's throat went dry. "I wanted you to know that," Kaelin continued, still not looking at him. "Before you make any noble decisions about peace and sacrifice, the hands you'd be holding in a bonding." Kaelin's face did something complicated. "We targeted military installations only. We used precision strikes. But in war," she trailed off, and for the first time since entering, she looked young, uncertain. "In war, precision is a comfortable lie we tell ourselves." They stood in silence for a long moment. Adrian found himself studying her, really looking rather than just seeing. She held herself like someone who'd learned early that showing weakness was dangerous, but there were cracks in the armor now, tiny fissurers. "Why did you come here?" Adrian asked. "To tell me about Kepler to see if you'd run." She moved away from the wall, pacing. "Now everyone runs eventually. They hear about Kesharthil, about the neural binding, about becoming permanently linked to someone from a species they barely understand. And they find excuses, political complications, cultural incompatibility, metaphysical concerns. It's always something. But you came anyway to every negotiation. My mother commands it. I'm the princess, the heir. My purpose is to serve the Empire, and if that service means being paraded in front of every species that wants to negotiate peace," she gestured sharply, "then I parade." "That's not an answer," Adrian said. Kalen stopped pacing, turned to face him fully. "What do you want me to say? That I dream of bonding with an alien I've never met? That I'm thrilled at the prospect of having my consciousness permanently altered to accommodate a human's emotional landscape? That I'm delighted to be the living treaty that binds two civilizations together? I want you to tell me the truth." "The truth?" She laughed again, but this time it sounded exhausted. "The truth is that I'm 26 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years fighting a war that should never have started. The truth is that I've written condolence messages to 300 families, explaining why their children died over misunderstandings and pride. The truth is that I wake up some nights feeling the Kepler assault playing on loop, wondering if there was another way, knowing there probably wasn't." She met his eyes. "The truth is that if marrying you, binding myself to a human I don't know and probably won't like, if that stops even one more family from getting a message like the one your family got about your sister, then yes, I'll do it. But don't ask me to be happy about it." Adrian found himself respecting her immensely. "I'm not particularly happy about it either, if that helps." "It doesn't, but it's something." She moved to the bed and sat down without asking, apparently deciding formal protocols were meaningless at this point. "So, Captain Adrian Reeves, tell me why I shouldn't hate you specifically." "Well, I have it on good authority that I'm cognitively flexible when interfacing with non-human cultural frameworks," Adrian said, sitting beside her, but keeping a careful distance. "Also, I once spent 6 weeks mediating a trade dispute between two species that communicated through interpretive dance and informatic chemical signals respectively. The Cantharan representative said watching me work was like watching someone try to negotiate with soup." The corner of Kalen's mouth twitched. "That's not encouraging. I got them to agree on mineral rights and a mutual defense pact." "How?" "I learned to dance very badly and bought a lot of perfume." He smiled. "The point is, I'm extremely good at being uncomfortable and doing it anyway. Is that supposed to make you an ideal husband? Probably not, but it might make me someone you can actually talk to." Adrian leaned back, letting the bed adjust around him. "Look, I don't know what Kesherethel actually means. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of consciousness merging your people apparently do casually. I definitely don't know if I'm qualified to marry royalty from a species whose architecture is sentient, and whose grasp of physics makes our best scientists weep. But I do know that I came here to stop a war, and if you're willing to bind yourself to some random human diplomat to achieve that, the least I can do is take the offer seriously." Kalen studied him for a long moment, and the lights in her ears shifted through several colors. Adrian was learning to read. Red anger fading, blue surprise, something green that might have been calculation. "You're actually considering it. I'm 48 hours away from having to decide. Considering seems like the minimum requirement. Most aliens spend those 48 hours looking for escape routes. Where would I go? Your people control this entire sector. Running would just confirm I'm not serious about peace." Adrian paused. "Also, your mother specifically phrased it as a threat. Refuse and we'll understand. Humanity considers you unworthy. That's not leaving a lot of diplomatic wiggle room." "She does that." Callan almost smiled, backs people into corners, and calls it offering choices. "Is she always this direct? You should have seen the Rielian negotiations. She told their ambassador that if he didn't stop posturing, she'd rearrange his molecular structure into something more aesthetically pleasing. He thought she was joking until she demonstrated on a chair." Adrian laughed, despite himself. "What happened to the chair?" "It's now a very confused throw pillow. We keep it in the East Wing as a conversation piece." They sat together in the strange, comfortable quiet that sometimes emerges between people who have decided to stop performing. Outside, the nebula pulsed its eternal rhythm. Inside, Adrian's AI companion was suspiciously silent, probably recording everything for future analysis. "I should go," Kalen said eventually, though she didn't move. "You need time to think. And I need to attend a war council where they'll ask me detailed questions about human defensive capabilities that I'll refuse to answer because apparently I'm being considered as a bride rather than an enemy. That must be strange. You have no idea." She stood, and her military bearing reasserted itself. "For what it's worth, Captain, you're less insufferable than I expected. That's the kindest thing anyone said to me all day. Don't get used to it. If you accept this bonding, I'll be in your head permanently. You'll experience my insufferability in high definition. She walked to the door, then paused. Reeves. Yes, my mother wasn't entirely honest with you. Kesharthal isn't just binding our consciousnesses. It's binding our civilizations. If we bond and it fails, if we prove incompatible, or if one of us dies before the resonance stabilizes, it will be interpreted as a fundamental incompatibility between our species. The war won't just continue, it will intensify. So, if you're going to refuse, refuse now. Don't waste time pretending. She left before Adrian could respond, the wall shimmering back to opacity behind her. Well, Iris said into the silence. She seems nice. She killed my sister's colleagues, and she's deeply traumatized by it. Did you notice the micro-expressions? The way she held herself when discussing Kepler? That's someone carrying significant guilt. Doesn't change what happened. No, Iris agreed. But it might change what happens next. Adrian lay back, letting the bed adjust around him like a supportive conscience. 48 hours, 2 days to decide if he was willing to permanently alter his consciousness, bind himself to a warrior princess from a species that made physics negotiable, and stake 2 civilizations' futures on his ability to make an alien marriage work. Iris, yes. What are the actual odds this ends? Well, the AI was silent for a long moment. Would you like the statistical analysis or the honest answer? Honest. I have absolutely no idea, but I haven't seen you run yet, and that might be the most important factor. Outside, the nebula pulsed. Inside, Adrian began drafting mental lists of questions he'd need answered before committing to cosmic matrimony. It was going to be a very long 48 hours. Adrian woke to the sensation of the room, gently humming a question at him. The walls had shifted to a soft amber color, pulsing in what he was learning to recognize as the Valfuran equivalent of a polite knock. He sat up, disoriented by dreams of neural networks and golden eyes, and croaked something that might have been agreement. The wall shimmered, but instead of Kalen, Sentinel Veras entered carrying what appeared to be a floating tray of food. Or possibly the tray was carrying itself, and Veras was just supervising. Adrian had stopped trying to determine which objects here were tools and which were cooperative organisms. The princess requests your presence for what she calls involuntary cultural orientation. Veras announced she suggests you eat first. Bonding negotiations apparently require significant caloric intake. Adrian eyed the food suspiciously. One item looked like fruit, but moved slightly when he wasn't looking directly at it. Another appeared to be bread that had achieved sentience and decided to arrange itself into aesthetically pleasing fractals. Is any of this going to make me hallucinate my ancestral memories or temporarily exist in multiple dimensions? Adrian asked. Not this early in the day, Vess said. That's typically reserved for evening meals. Adrian couldn't tell if she was joking. He ate the fruit cautiously. It tasted like strawberries crossed with starlight, if starlight had flavor, and the bread dissolved pleasantly on his tongue, leaving the sensation of warm comfort that had definitely been engineered by someone who understood human neurology better than most humans did. Where exactly am I meeting the princess? Adrian asked between bites of something that tasted like the concept of satisfaction. The Remembrance Gardens. She says if you're going to potentially bond with her, you should understand what you're bonding to. Vars's ear crystals flickered blue. Fair warning, Captain. The gardens contain memory-responsive plant life. Try not to think too loudly about anything embarrassing. 20 minutes later, Adrian followed Vars through corridors that had rearranged themselves overnight. He was reasonably certain this wasn't the same route they'd taken yesterday, but the crystalline spire apparently subscribed to dynamic architecture. Iris kept trying to map their progress and eventually gave up, noting that Euclidean geometry was more of a suggestion here than a rule. The gardens opened before them like a secret being revealed. Unlike the crystalline sterility of the spire's interior, this space was overwhelmingly alive. Plants grew in impossible spirals, their leaves catching light that seemed to originate from within the vegetation itself. Flowers bloomed in colors Adrian's eyes couldn't quite process, and the air smelled like rain on copper mixed with something sweetly alien. Kalen stood beside a tree whose bark moved in slow waves, dressed in dark training clothes that suggested she'd already been through some kind of morning combat routine. She looked up as Adrian approached, and her expression was marginally less hostile than yesterday. Marginal was progress. You came, she said, I'm trying to decide if being stood up by your potential alien bride would start or prevent a war. Adrian replied. You seemed safer to show up. The corner of her mouth twitched. The gardens are one of the few places in the spire where I can actually think. Everything else is constantly humming with collective consciousness. Here, the plants are just plants. Mostly, she gestured to a bench that grew directly from the ground, its surface smooth and warm. Sit. If we're going to discuss the absurdity of our situation, we might as well be comfortable. Adrian sat, and the bench adjusted beneath him with the same uncanny consideration as everything Valuran. Kaylin remained standing, one hand resting on the moving tree bark. I barely slept, she admitted, kept thinking about what bonding with a human would actually mean. Our consciousness patterns are different. Our emotional ranges don't align perfectly. There's a reason Kasharthil has never been attempted cross-species successfully. That's encouraging. I'm not trying to encourage you. I'm trying to be honest. She turned to face him fully. The Cantheran merchant prince I mentioned, he didn't just leave because of profit margins. He left because the initial resonance test, the basic compatibility screening, showed that his neurological structure literally couldn't support the kind of emotional bandwidth Kasharthil requires. It would have damaged him permanently. Adrian's stomach tightened. And you think humans might have the same problem? I think I don't know. And that terrifies me, more than you can imagine. Kaylin sat down beside him closer than yesterday, and Adrian caught her scent, something like cinnamon and ozone. If we attempt this and it fails, if your consciousness can't integrate with mine, you won't just walk away uncomfortable. You could end up with permanent psychic scarring, fragmented sense of self, possibly complete psychological collapse. You're really selling this, Adrian said weakly. I'm telling you what my mother conveniently left out. She stared at her hands. 300 years ago, there was a bonding between two Valkyrans from different genetic lines. The resonance was incompatible. Both went mad within hours. They had to be kept in separate meditation chambers for the rest of their lives. Consciousness too shattered to ever fully reform. Adrian processed this. So your mother is asking me to potentially destroy my own mind for peace. She's asking you to risk it. There's a difference. Kaylin's ear crystals flickered through several colors rapidly, but she's also desperate. The War Council wants total escalation. There are generals who believe humanity will inevitably betray any treaty, that the only solution is complete military dominance. My mother is fighting them, but she needs something dramatic to justify peace. A bonding would be. She trailed off. Dramatic, Adrian finished. Unprecedented. Unassailable. If we bond successfully, no Vitheran could argue for war without arguing against our empire's most sacred union. She looked at him sidelong. You'd be family. Literally part of the royal consciousness line. Harming humanity would be harming me, and by extension the entire Valoran leadership structure. That's actually fairly clever politically. My mother didn't become queen by being subtle. Kaylin stood abruptly pacing between luminescent plants. But here's what you need to understand about Kasharthil. It's not marriage as humans practice it. You don't just promise to stay together and share resources. You become partially the same person. I'll feel your emotions as clearly as my own. You'll sense my thoughts even when I'm not speaking. Our dreams will overlap. Our memories will gradually merge. In 20 years, I won't remember if certain childhood experiences were mine or yours, and neither will you. That sounds. Adrian struggled for words. Invasive, terrifying, like consensual identity dissolution. I was going to say intimate, but those work too. Kaylin stopped pacing. You're not running. I ran the calculations last night, Adrian said. If I refuse, what happens? Your mother interprets it as humanity's rejection of Valforan culture. The war escalates. More people die. Maybe my species loses. Maybe yours does. Maybe we just bleed each other for another decade. He stood walking to where she stood. If I accept and it works, we potentially end a conflict that's killed thousands. If I accept and it fails, I go insane. But at least I tried. That's not rational decision-making. That's martyrdom. That's diplomacy, Adrian corrected. Everything I've done for the last 6 years has been calculated risks with other people's lives in the balance. At least this time I'm only risking my own consciousness. She stared at him, and something shifted in her expression. You actually mean that? I actually mean that. You're either the bravest human I've ever met, or the most spectacularly stupid. I've been told those aren't mutually exclusive. Adrian smiled. Besides, You said it yourself. You killed 83 humans. I contributed to policies that got Valurans killed. We're both carrying weight. Maybe bonding will either crush us both or distribute the load. Kaylin made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. That's the most depressing basis for marriage I've ever heard. Then help me understand the less depressing parts. Show me your culture. Explain what bonding actually means from your perspective. I've got Adrian checked his internal chronometer. Approximately 36 hours left to decide. Let's use them. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded sharply. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you when my people's courtship rituals make you question your commitment to peace. What followed was the strangest cultural orientation Adrian had ever experienced. Kaylin led him through the gardens, pointing out plants that responded to emotional states, flowers that bloomed brighter when she laughed, vines that curled protectively when she felt threatened. She explained that Valurans didn't distinguish between psychological and physical reality the way humans did. Thought, emotion, and matter were different expressions of the same fundamental essence. That's why Kesharthel works for us, she said, running her hand over a plant whose leaves rearranged themselves into mathematical patterns. We don't see consciousness as something separate from the body. Binding two consciousnesses is just rearranging the same essential material into a new configuration. Like the chair your mother turned into a pillow, Adrian said. Exactly like that, except with less furniture and more identity merger. They moved through sections of the gardens that seemed to exist in different seasons simultaneously. Summer heat in one area, winter snow in another, separated by mere meters and no apparent environmental controls. Kaylin explained quantum probability fields and how Valtharian gardeners cultivated multiple weather states in sewer position until observation collapsed them into experience. So, this snow is both real and not real until I touch it, Adrian asked, watching frozen fractals drift past. It's real in one probability branch and not in another. By touching it, you're just choosing which branch you're experiencing. She grabbed a handful of snow and threw it at him. It was cold, wet, and definitely real in the way that faceful of snow tended to be. Welcome to the real branch. Adrian wiped melting snow from his face, laughing. That's definitely a metaphor for something. For making decisions and living with consequences. Kaylin's expression softened. For choosing reality rather than staying in comfortable uncertainty. Now who's being depressing? They sat by a pond where fish swam in patterns that Iris insisted were prime numbers expressed in biological motion. Kaylin talked about her childhood, about growing up knowing she was a political tool first and a person second. Adrian talked about his sister, about studying xenolinguistics because he'd always felt like an outsider in his own culture, about desperately wanting to believe different species could understand each other despite everything suggesting otherwise. The more you talk, Kaylin said quietly, the more I can see why they sent you. Because I'm naive and idealistic, because you actually care. She turned to face him, and her golden eyes caught the strange light filtering through prismatic leaves. Most diplomats are performing caring. You're just doing it. Even knowing I killed people you knew. Even facing permanent psychological damage. You're still here trying to understand. You're still here too. Adrian pointed out. Despite having every reason to resent being used as a treaty. Maybe we're both idiots. Or maybe we both think peace is worth the cost. Kaylin reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away. She placed her palm against his, the formal Valoran gesture she'd mentioned. This time, the emotional resonance was stronger. Adrian felt her conflict, duty versus resentment, hope versus cynicism, and underneath it all, bone-deep exhaustion from carrying too much weight for too long. She gasped softly. Your emotions are so loud. Humans feel everything so intensely, like you're broadcasting at maximum volume all the time. Is that bad? I don't know yet. But she didn't pull her hand away. But it's not uncomfortable, just different. They stayed like that, palms pressed together, consciousness bleeding at the edges, until the garden's ambient light shifted toward evening. Somewhere in the distance, the crystalline spire hummed its eternal song. 36 hours, Adrian said softly. 36 hours, Kaylin agreed. Then we decide if we're brave enough to be bonded, or smart enough to admit this is insane. Can it be both? She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Yes, but I'm not sure that helps. They walked back through gardens that whispered with memory and possibility, two people from different species trying to decide if peace was worth the price of themselves. Adrian spent his final hours before the decision, walking the crystalline spire's observation platforms, watching ships come and go like silver thoughts against the nebula. Iris had gone uncharacteristically quiet, perhaps sensing that some decisions existed beyond algorithmic analysis. He'd sent a message back to the Unified Council, explaining the situation in carefully diplomatic language that absolutely failed to capture the absurdity of marry alien princess, or restart war. Their response had been predictably bureaucratic, exercise judgment within mission parameters, which meant they were leaving this entirely on him while maintaining plausible deniability if it went catastrophically wrong. He was composing a third draft of his mental pros and cons list when the spire shuddered. Not gently like the usual quantum fluctuations, but violently, a deep resonance that felt wrong at a fundamental level. Emergency lights flared through the crystalline walls, shifting from ambient blue to sharp red. Iris, what was that? Explosion in the lower engineering sectors. I'm detecting. The AI's voice crackled with interference. Captain, there's something wrong with the data. The blast pattern doesn't match accidental detonation. This was deliberate. Adrian was already running toward the central corridors when Veres materialized from a side passage. Moving with liquid urgency. Captain Reeves, you need to come with me now. What's happening? Sabotage. Someone wants to ensure the bonding fails. She grabbed his arm, pulling him into a transit tube that shot them vertically through the spire at speeds that made Adrian's stomach protest. The Queen is securing the throne room. Princess Kaylin is already there. They emerged into chaos. Guards in crystalline armor moved in precise patterns, securing entrances while technicians worked on wall panels that sparked and reformed. Queen Lysara stood at the chamber center, her living garments cycling through angry reds and oranges, while Kaylin stood beside her in full combat gear, a weapon Adrian couldn't name held with professional ease. Captain Reeves, the Queen said sharply. Excellent timing. We have a problem. I noticed the explosion, Adrian said, trying to catch his breath. That was merely the opening move. She gestured, and the chamber's center floor became transparent, displaying lower levels in crystalline clarity. Adrian could see Valferan security forces engaged in what looked like a standoff with other Valferans near the spire's power core. General Torvash and elements of the War Council have decided that peace is unacceptable. They staged this sabotage to be discovered in 30 minutes, precisely when your deadline expires, and plan to frame it as human saboteurs infiltrating our most sacred space. That's insane, Adrian said. That's politics, Kaylin corrected grimly. Tovash has been arguing for total war since the Kepler incident. He believes any peace with humanity is temporary at best, catastrophic at worst. Better to strike while we have advantage. Adrian watched the standoff below, mind racing. But framing humans for sabotage doesn't make sense. I'm already here. I'm clearly not sneaking around planting bombs, which is why they needed to be caught before the framing was complete. Queen Lysara said, We've been monitoring Torvash for months. Today he finally moved. Unfortunately, he has supporters. Significant portions of our military believe humanity cannot be trusted. Can we be? Adrian asked quietly. Kaylin's head snapped toward him. What? Honest question. I've spent 2 days learning about Kesharthal, about consciousness binding, about your culture's approach to trust, but I'm one human. I don't represent my entire species. He turned to face Queen Lysara directly. Even if I bond with your daughter, even if it works perfectly, there will be humans who oppose peace, generals who want revenge for Kepler, politicians who see Valfurans as threats. How does our bonding prevent that? The Queen studied him with those shifting copper-gold eyes. It doesn't, but it changes the conversation from, can we trust them, to, we are them. You become Valoran through Kesharthal. Not metaphorically, literally. Your consciousness becomes part of our collective resonance. Harming humanity means harming family, and humans will know one of their own is bonded to your royal line. Callan added, you'll be living proof that integration is possible, that we're not incompatible at the level of consciousness. Or Adrian said slowly, I'll be proof that Valfurans can subvert human minds. There are definitely factions back home who will interpret Kesharthal as hostile mind control. Kaylin and her mother exchanged glances. We hadn't considered that perspective, the Queen admitted. Because you think of bonding as partnership, we'll think of it as invasion. Adrian began pacing the way he always did when working through complex negotiations. That's the core problem, isn't it? Not trust, but fundamental incompatibility in how we conceptualize consciousness. You see it as collective, shareable. We see it as individual, inviolable. So, what are you suggesting? Kaylin asked. That bonding won't work. I'm suggesting we need to modify it. Adrian stopped pacing. Idea crystallizing. Your mother mentioned that no cross-species Kesharthal has succeeded, but has anyone tried making it transparent? Building in safeguards that both species can verify transparent how? Queen Lysara leaned forward, interested. Open the bonding ceremony to representatives from both civilizations. Let human neuroscientists observe alongside Valtheran empaths. Create protocols where Kaylin and I can demonstrate the bonding is consensual and ongoing, not a one-time mind control event. Adrian felt momentum building. Make it a living treat that requires continuous consent from both parties, with built-in verification that it's not causing psychological damage. Below them, the standoff was intensifying. General Torvash's forces had expanded their perimeter. Adrian could see the general himself, now imposing, decorated with battle honors, radiating the kind of certainty that made compromise impossible. He won't accept any bonding, Kaylin said, following Adrian's gaze. Modified or not, he's committed to war. Then we need to prove him wrong in a way he can't dispute. Adrian turned to Queen Lysara. You said the sabotage was meant to frame humans. What if we expose that publicly, then offer the modified bonding as contrast? Show that some Valkyrans want war badly enough to lie, while some humans want peace badly enough to risk consciousness merger. That's politically dangerous, the Queen said. Exposing Torvash means admitting division in our military. You're already divided. This just makes it obvious. Adrian moved to the transparent floor, looking down at the general, and it gives the peace faction, your faction, something concrete to point to. You're not weak for wanting peace. You're strong enough to try something unprecedented. Queen Lysara was silent for a long moment, then smiled slowly. You think like a Valuran, Captain Reeves, turning vulnerability into strength. She touched her earrings and they chimed through a complex sequence. Throughout the spire, communications activated. What followed happened faster than Adrian could track. The Queen broadcast evidence of Torvash's sabotage to every Valkyran in the spire simultaneously, not through words, but through shared emotional resonance. Adrian watched Valorans throughout the visible levels literally feel the betrayal, the manipulation, the general's contempt for Kesharthal and everything it represented. The standoff collapsed within minutes. Torvs's supporters, confronted with undeniable proof of deception, stood down. The general himself was taken into custody, still broadcasting defiant certainty, even as his cause crumbled. Well, Kaylin said into the sudden quiet. That was dramatic. I'm told I excel at creating diplomatic incidents, Adrian said, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. She laughed, actually laughed, genuine and surprised. You just convinced my mother to expose military conspiracy and revolutionize our most sacred bonding ritual in about 5 minutes. I work well under pressure. Clearly, she stepped closer, and Adrian could see she was trembling slightly. So, modified Keshar Ethel, transparent, consensual, verifiable. Does that mean you're accepting? Adrian took a breath. I'm accepting that peace requires risk. I'm accepting that understanding between species might mean literally sharing consciousness. I'm accepting that you're brave enough to try this, which means I should be too. He held out his hand, palm up, the Valuran gesture. I'm accepting that I'd rather fail trying than succeed at staying separate. Kaylin placed her palm against his, and the resonance hit harder than before. He felt her relief, her terror, her cautious hope. She felt his determination, his grief for his sister, his absolute refusal to let fear make his decisions. This is probably insane, she whispered. Definitely insane, Adrian agreed. My mother is already organizing the ceremony modifications. We'd have about 6 hours to prepare. Then I should probably practice not panicking when I feel someone else's emotions in my head. Too late. I can already feel your panic. It tastes like static and poor decisions. That's just my personality. They stood there, palms pressed together, consciousness beginning the slow work of learning to share space. Queen Lysara watched from her floating dais, her expression carefully neutral, but her garment cycling through pleased purples. The War Council will need to approve the modified ritual, the Queen said, but given that we just arrested their primary war advocate for sabotage, I suspect they'll be amenable to alternatives. And Humanity's Council? Adrian asked. will receive a very detailed transmission explaining their diplomat's unprecedented diplomatic solution. She smiled, including the part where you potentially prevented escalation by agreeing to permanent consciousness merger with alien royalty. They're going to love that in the bureaucratic reports, Iris observed dryly, finally breaking silence. The next 6 hours were controlled chaos. Human neuroscientists were summoned via quantum communication. Valtharian empaths prepared the ceremonial space. Adrian and Kaylin underwent compatibility screening that confirmed what they'd already sensed. Their consciousness patterns, while different, had complementary structures. His emotional intensity matched her disciplined control. Her tactical thinking balanced his diplomatic flexibility. It's like we're designed to offset each other's weaknesses, the lead empath explained. Unusual for same-species bonding, unprecedented for cross-species. So we're freaks, Kaylin said. You're pioneers. There's a difference. The ceremony itself was nothing like human weddings. No vows, no rings, no symbolic gestures. Just Adrian and Kaylin sitting in crystalline chairs, while empaths and scientists monitored from behind transparent barriers. The actual bonding felt like falling and flying simultaneously, consciousness expanding to accommodate another present's thoughts that weren't his, suddenly available, emotions that tasted different but comprehensible. He felt Kepler through her memories, not justification, but raw truth. The fear, the necessity, the aftermath. She felt his sister's death through his grief, the loss that never healed, the specific absence. Neither tried to change the other's experience, just acknowledged it, held it together. The bond stabilized after 3 hours. Adrian stood and Kaylin stood with him, and they both laughed because moving felt different now, like moving in harmony with someone who wasn't physically present, but was always there. How do you feel? Queen Lysara asked. Like myself, Adrian said. But more like drowning, Kaylin added. But in a good way. That's normal, the empath assured them. Integration takes time. The modified Kesherthal worked. Within days, verification protocols confirmed that both Adrian and Kaylin retained individual consciousness while sharing emotional resonance. Within weeks, the first cross-species diplomatic corps formed, trained in techniques adapted from their bonding. Within months, border conflicts declined as soldiers from both species learned to recognize shared patterns. Adrian never stopped being human. Kaylin never stopped being Valoran, but they became something additional. Proof that consciousness could bridge differences without erasing them. Years later, when their daughter was born, half human, half Valtharian, with her mother's golden eyes and her father's terrible sense of humor, they took her to the Remembrance Gardens. The plants bloomed in new colors, responding to a consciousness pattern they'd never encountered before. She's beautiful, Kaylin said, cradling the child whose ears were neither fully human nor fully elongated. She's terrifying, Adrian corrected, feeling through their bond that Kaylin agreed completely. She's going to be negotiating interstellar treaties before she's 5 or starting them. That too. They sat together, 3 consciousnesses in careful harmony, watching ships move through the nebula beyond. Peace wasn't simple. It wasn't even always peaceful, but it was possible. And that